Just let it go. You have to move on. We say it to people who are grieving, and we mean it kindly. Time to put it down. Time to look ahead. It comes from a good place, every word of it. But there's a moment when that gentle sentence lands like a wall instead of a comfort. If you've ever felt more alone right after someone told you to move on, if everyone else seems to have walked ahead while you're the only one still standing in the same spot, quietly wondering what's wrong with you for not being able to let go. If you've ever lain awake, blaming yourself for exactly that, then I'd like you to stay with me tonight. Let me start at the end. The fact that you can't let go doesn't mean you're weak. Some losses simply have no ending. There is no clean point where grief closes and you step neatly into what comes next. For certain kinds of loss, that point was never there to begin with. Tonight, I want to talk about why some grief doesn't end and why that isn't a flaw in you, but something much closer to the shape of love itself. It's a strange promise, I know, that the thing hurting you might not be a wound waiting to close, but a bond you were never meant to sever. Give me the next few minutes and I think it will make sense. To find where we got the idea that grief is supposed to end, you have to go back to one man, Sigmund Freud, the founder of psychoanalysis. In 1917, he wrote a short paper called Mourning and Melancholia. In it, he sketched a picture of how loss works. When we lose someone we love, the mind begins a slow, exhausting task. One thread at a time, it withdraws all the affection it had tied to that person. Freud called this grief work. It takes time, but when the work is finished, the mind is free again, ready to attach to something new. You mourn, and slowly, the world fills back in around the empty space. That was his promise. And for a great many losses, it holds true. Time really does do its quiet work. And when the work goes wrong, Freud called that state melancholia. It's when the feeling that should have reached the person who left loses its way and turns back against the self instead. So, mourning, he said, loses the world. But melancholia loses the self. In his own image, the shadow of the person who left falls across the one who stays. That's the Freud in the textbooks. Grief is a task, and a good task has an ending. And then, there's the other Freud. Freud had a daughter named Sophie. In 1920, the Spanish flu took her at 26. She was married, with 2 small children of her own. And 9 years later, his old friend, the Swiss psychiatrist Ludwig Binswanger, lost a son. So Freud sat down to write him a letter of comfort on a day that happened to be Sophie's birthday. In it, he writes this: "Although we know that after such a loss the acute state of mourning will subside, we also know we shall remain inconsolable and will never find a substitute. No matter what may fill the gap, even if it be filled completely, it nevertheless remains something else." The man who told the world that grief was a task with an ending admitted, in the face of his own daughter's memory, that it doesn't end. Not after 9 years. To me, that quiet contradiction is more honest than any of his papers. In theory, he spoke of endings. As a father, he knew there wasn't one, and he never published that part. It stayed in a private letter to a grieving friend, which is perhaps the only place a truth that tender ever gets said out loud. A century later, someone else took the truth Freud had tucked into the corner of a private letter and built it squarely into a theory. Her name is Pauline Boss, an American family therapist. The title of her book, published by Harvard University Press, says it plainly: Ambiguous Loss. In the 1970s, Boss studied the families of soldiers who had gone missing in the Vietnam War. No death notice, no homecoming. Those families waited years, not knowing whether a husband, a son, was alive or dead. They couldn't even hold a funeral because nothing had been confirmed. Boss gave this kind of loss a name: ambiguous loss. A loss with no confirmed ending. Because it isn't clear the way a death is clear, the world often fails to recognize it. There's no ritual, no funeral, no casserole on the doorstep, and so it gets lonelier, and it lasts longer. No one brings a card for a grief no one can name. And she says it lives far closer to us than we think. There are, roughly, two kinds. The first, the person is gone from your life but still fully present in your mind. The breakup where the other person is out there somewhere, living well, their updates still surfacing on your feed. The parent an ocean away after emigration, clearly not with you and yet not entirely gone. You end up grieving someone who is technically still out there living a life. There's no word for that, and no ceremony, so you tend to carry it quietly, half convinced you have no right to call it grief at all. The second kind is the reverse. The body is right here, but the person is not. A mother with dementia who no longer recognizes your face. Everything about her looks the same, and the person you knew is already no longer in the room. People who have cared for them for years will tell you it feels like holding two funerals for one person. And here Boss takes aim at a word we're all rather fond of, closure. Do you know where that word mostly comes from? It's closer to a business term, the way you would close a deal or close on a house. Sign the contract and the transaction is done. Boss asks the obvious question. How exactly do you close the love between two people the way you close a sale? Once you have let someone into your heart, who can simply flip a switch and turn it off? That was never how the heart was built. And when we can't do it, we quietly assume that we are the ones who are broken. But the failure was never really ours. It belonged to the word. Closure was the wrong tool for this job from the start. In her own words, there is no such thing as closure. We have to live with loss, clear or ambiguous, and it's okay. And one thing has to be said clearly. Boss is firm that this grief, the kind that doesn't end, is not an illness. Complicated, yes, but a perfectly normal grief. It is a different thing entirely from the clinical depression Freud was worried about. That doesn't mean Boss is telling you to sink into grief and stay there forever. That's a misreading. For Boss, the grief that doesn't end is something a person can carry as long as they stay connected to the people around them. But if that connection breaks too, and you find yourself sinking alone, that's a depression that needs real help. Saying it's okay to be sad was never the same as saying don't reach for help when you're hurting. What Boss offers instead can sound a little strange at first. She says, hold both. He is gone, and he is still with me. We were taught you have to choose one of those two. Boss says both can be true at the same time. Between letting go and holding on, you don't actually have to pick a side. You can keep a place for the person you lost, right there in a corner of your heart, and still eat breakfast, and go to work, and laugh today. Those two things aren't at odds. You don't get better by cutting the love out. You get better by making room for it to live alongside everything else. So here is the one small thing I would offer to change. There's a question we keep asking ourselves in grief. When will I finally be okay? And that question quietly assumes grief has an ending. So when the time passes and you are still not okay, it circles back to you as self-blame, as if not finishing were somehow your fault. What if you traded that question for a different one? Not, when will I be okay, but how do I carry this? The moment you stop making finishing the goal, something loosens in the chest. You can breathe a little, because not finished stops being a failure, and carrying it looks like small, ordinary things. Keeping their photo up on the shelf instead of moving it into a drawer. Telling a story about them on some random Tuesday, and letting yourself smile before the ache catches up. Leaving a place for them in your life, not to pretend they're still here, but to keep them company on the way. None of that is you refusing to heal. That is what healing actually looks like for a loss like this. Closure, it turns out, may have been a destination we could never reach in the first place. If the grief doesn't end, perhaps it's because the love hasn't ended either. So if there is someone you still can't let go of tonight, that isn't you failing to finish something. That's you still loving someone. That is what I'd want to hold on to. That letter of Freud's, there is actually one more line. The man who, 9 years on, wrote that he remained inconsolable. ends the letter like this. And actually, that is how it should be. It is the only way of perpetuating that love which we do not want to relinquish. Thank you, as always, for coming this far with me.
Don't ask when you'll be okay. Let that question go. Ask instead, how do I carry this? Ask it soft, ask it slow. Just let it go, they say. You got to move on now. And they mean it kind, I know, but I felt more alone somehow.